Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for Genoa Healthcare's webinar on medication-assisted treatment for substance use disorder, trends in the opioid epidemic and treatment options. We'll begin in a moment, but before we do so, I just want to point all of your attention to the middle of the screen where you see the Q&A box. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar using this button at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to answer them live at the end of the session. If we do not get to your question, we will follow up promptly with you after the webinar with a response. And with you today is Kevin O'Connell, our Vice President of Sales for Genoa, bringing 10 plus years of pharmacy experience in behavioral health. Myself, Lindsey Hall, the Senior Director of Clinical Programs within Genoa's Pharmacy Solutions Division. And we're very excited to have Percy Menzies on the panel with us today. He's the president of the Assisted Recovery Centers of America, an outpatient center for the treatment of substance use disorders based in St. Louis. ARCA is a long-term partner of Genoa, and we're happy to present together today on this important topic. Our objectives today are to briefly touch on COVID-19 updates as it remains front of mind for all of us during this time. We will then shift to recent trends in and an overview of the opioid epidemic in the United States. We will discuss key pillars of providing treatment for consumers and substance use disorder, both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical treatment, ending with how integrated pharmacy can improve outcomes and support making treatment attractive for the consumers we serve. To briefly review key updates in the COVID-19 pandemic since our last webinar, our country has seen incredible progress in reopening, with most states having reopened entirely. This is largely due to vaccination, with over 60% of adults having received or reporting that they are actively looking to receive their first vaccine dose as of May. This is an increase of 6% from April. The wait and see group continues to decline, but there are still 20% of adults who report that they would refuse the vaccine or only receive it if required by their school or job. This is even greater in rural areas, with nearly a quarter reporting that they will not get vaccinated. Interestingly, though, up to 15% of those report that they would get vaccinated if incentivized, either financially or through food or event tickets, or even if they were able to obtain a ride to receive it. 75% of adults report they would be willing to receive the vaccine if it was available at their doctor's office. Genoa is helping to bring vaccines to all of the clinics and communities we serve. If you do not have this capability today or would like to increase its reach, please reach out to your DOO or Genoa contact if you're interested in learning more. Another great improvement since we last met is the ability to vaccinate younger populations. As of May, 41% of parents stated that their 12 to 17-year-old has received one vaccine dose or is working to obtain the dose. Pfizer has completed phase 1 of studies for children aged 6 months to 11, and results from phases 2 and 3 are expected throughout the fall, getting the results for the older populations sooner and those less than 2 later in the fall. Moderna studies in this population also continue. Finally, Moderna has recently applied as of June 1st for full approval of its vaccine. This is a really exciting change, as a good proportion of patients who report that they're unwilling to get a vaccine report that they would consider doing so with full approval. Additionally, we're looking to see a likely fourth vaccine option in fall 2021. Novavax is likely to be this next vaccine option, and they've seen great efficacy thus far, seeing a little over 90% efficacy in preventing symptomatic COVID and 100% efficacy in preventing severe illness, hospitalization, and death. And with that, Kevin, I'll turn it over to you to get going with the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Lindsey. While I appreciate a good COVID update, I can't wait until that is a thing of the past and we no longer have to speak those words anymore, but thank you for that informative update. The reason why we're here today primarily is to talk about substance use disorder and MAT and how we can improve the way that we touch lives of those suffering with those states. And this slide here really is impactful, I believe. So the term up top was expertly coined by my co-presenter Percy today. We're really facing an epidemic within the pandemic. And some of these statistics, I'm going to throw a lot of percentages at you here. 13% of people, adults, reported new or increased use in drugs or alcohol through COVID-19. And even worse, 25% of young adults reported new or increased use. So we know that this is becoming more of an issue through the pandemic. Of people that used recreational drugs prior to COVID-19, 31% reported an increase in recreational drug use. And then 26% of Americans, I believe this was probably a little bit low on the reporting side, reported coping with self-isolation by using alcohol or an increased use of drugs. This is an ongoing issue uniquely to the United States of America. The number one cause of death for individuals under 50 now is accidental drug overdose. And if that doesn't put a stronger focus on the need to change how we look at substance use disorder and how we treat substance use disorder, it's a startling statistic that we really need to bring furthermore into the zeitgeist. Let's look at some treatment options, the current options that are available. I'm going to briefly touch on these because they're probably familiar to most everyone on the call, but we'll talk about some intricacies involved with each of the treatment options and how we can maximize their usage. The first is the old standby, methadone. Methadone was approved in 1974 under the Narcotic Addict Treatment Act. Some unique things about methadone is it must be dispensed at a treatment clinic. Traditional retail pharmacies cannot dispense methadone for MAT purposes. They can only dispense it for pain purposes, and prescriptions must be written explicitly as such. The drug does require baseline and continuous ECG monitoring because of the QT elongation potential. And then the concern that comes up with methadone, is it just a replacement addiction? It's a medicine that it replaces the substance that someone would normally use. And it has a higher safety risk than some of the other MAT options. We know it has an increased risk of respiratory depression, overdose risk, diversion risk, and there's many food and drug interactions coming with methadone. Now, most everyone is probably familiar with this drug, buprenorphine, or you've heard it be used as Subutex, Sublocade, Suboxone. So this is a semi-synthetic opioid with partial agonist activity. So it has strong affinity for the receptor, but weaker opioid activity. This really increases the risk for precipitated withdrawal. So it must be initiated after withdrawal symptoms have begun. So there are many forms available. You've probably seen the dissolvable buccal tablets. There's the sublingual films, and new to market are injectable forms such as Sublocade and upcoming Brixadi, which are depot subcutaneous injections to improve some making sure that people take the medication on time. And buprenorphine can be used with combination with naloxone. And so the naloxone is really there to reduce the abuse potential of people using buprenorphine recreationally. And moving on to naltrexone. So naltrexone is a little bit different. It's a full blocking antagonist. So it acts rather as a deterrent rather than anti-craving. While the previous two medications, methadone and buprenorphine, really act to reduce cravings in those seeking drugs, naltrexone is a deterrent. So if you use while you're on naltrexone, you don't get the same effects. It has no abuse potential, and it has no street value and no chance of dependency. It's not a controlled substance. The difficulty with naltrexone is that the oral form, which is much less expensive than an injectable form, has severe adherence issues. And really, the ability for someone the motivation for someone to have abstinence is really what's going to drive success with this medication. So it is available in a monthly injection in the form of Vivitrol. And it should be noted that patients must be opioid free for 7 to 10 days before initiating therapy on naltrexone to reduce that risk of precipitated withdrawal. So let's talk about Narcan. Narcan is an issue that's very near and dear to my heart, and the chemical name here, naloxone. So Narcan, quite simply, saves lives. There's no other easy way to say it. It's a pure opioid receptor antagonist, so it displaces any opioids in an overdose situation. So it's used as a temporary treatment to reverse an opioid overdose. And this is something I wanted to point out on the screen here. This is a common misconception that access to naloxone, giving someone Narcan, will increase non-medical opioid use. And statistically, that's not just what we find. We know that when Narcan is available and accessible, that, like I said, it saves lives. So who's a good candidate for Narcan? Well, anyone taking opioid medications, frankly, should have access to Narcan. People who have been discharged from the ER following an opioid overdose or an intoxication should really have Narcan on hand. Anyone who takes extended or long release opioid products, Narcan is a good choice. And people using opioids in conjunction with other medications like benzodiazepines, where we know the risk of respiratory depression is even greater. So the good news is there has been a lot of work in expanding access of naloxone and Narcan throughout the population. And SAMHSA has done a lot of work expanding access. There was an opioid overdose prevention toolkit that was published in 2018, and that really helps communities develop policies and practices to make naloxone available within the community where people need it. And then there are laws and policies which make naloxone easier to get. So we know that there's traditional prescriptions that your doctor can prescribe for naloxone. Just about every state now has some sort of state protocol or collaborative practice agreement in which a pharmacist can access essentially a pre-written prescription to provide naloxone to patients who need it. Essentially, it's without a prescription, right? They can walk in and use that standing order. It's an important idea here that not only the patients using the medications, using the opioids should have access to naloxone, but it's imperative that first responders like police and fire and EMTs have access to it, as well as friends and family members of those who use opioids. That's key. These are the people that are going to be around if there's an overdose situation and can save a life. Now, this is a bit of a startling graph here. As you can see, the situation is getting worse. The opioid epidemic really began in the 90s, and it's a situation that unfortunately compounds year over year as more people use opioids. Drug overdose deaths in the US, this is a statistic from 2019. So it reached a record last year with 71, that's essentially 72,000 deaths from drug overdoses in the United States. These are more deaths in a year than wars. It's a staggering statistic. And it's even worse in some states. So we know that in 2020, the situation got worse. As data continues to come in from that, we have some preliminary information from the New York Times stating that it's risen by 13%. In some especially hard-hit areas, like along the Appalachians, Delaware, the death toll's risen by 60% alone in 2020. Should be noted here that all of the deaths noted in this chart were from all drugs, but the majority of them, 70% or more, were from synthetic opioids. And we know that according to JAMA, 75% of people who use heroin started their use of non-prescription opioids from a prescription opioid. And the majority of those were given to them or stolen from a friend or family member. This chart, if we leave you with nothing today, it should be a rising call to all of us that we need to do more to prevent deaths and to treat people properly who use substances. So let's shift from that into what can we do to help. So there are traditional methodologies of treatment, which is abstinence. So this is with or without naltrexone therapy, not using the substance which you were using before. Then, of course, education, and that includes educating both patients who use opioids as well as family members. So there are multiple helplines available. SAMHSA has a helpline, as well as Narcotics Anonymous and Nar-Anon, which is a great resource for family and friends. And then another methodology is harm reduction. So there's been some really great work being done where some states have developed safe injection sites or safe usage centers, where if we know people are going to use opioids, to give them a safe space to do so. We've also seen drug testing kits and drug testing sites become available to make sure that if someone is going to use a substance, that they have a way to make sure that it does not contain a more dangerous substance like fentanyl or worse, carfentanil, which is extremely, extremely deadly in very, very small doses. And then, of course, what we were focusing on today, which is treatment. So treating an individual who has used substances before with medication. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about how a pharmacy can play a role in patients' therapy and share some stories of what we've done at some of our Genoa Healthcare locations. And then I want to turn it over to Percy to talk about how do we modernize treatment today. When you see that chart, we know that what we've done in the past is not working all that well. So how do we make it easier and more attractive for people to seek treatment? So this is where I've spent the majority of my career. I've been a pharmacist for about 20 years. I'm still a licensed pharmacist in the state of Rhode Island. So the first thing pharmacy can do is to ensure proper prescribing and dispensing of opioid prescriptions. We've talked a lot today about how dangerous they can be, but there still is a place for opioids in medication. We don't want anyone to suffer from pain. So it really begins within the prescribing and at the pharmacy to ensure that prescriptions are written properly in proper amounts and dosages, and to check for any interactions to make sure that we don't leave anyone at a greater risk of opioid addiction. Another thing we can do at the pharmacy is really stigma reduction. And it sounds so simple, but treating people like people rather than treating people like addicts. And that's really what we've tried to shift our focus here at Genoa Healthcare and change the mindset of the pharmacists and the technicians that deal with consumers every day who are undergoing MAT. In my home state of Rhode Island, we've been very fortunate to be part of a 3-year, now extended to 4-year study in which 13 of our pharmacists in 6 of our locations are involved in a collaborative practice agreement. And this collaborative practice agreement allows our pharmacists to take patients who are in active withdrawal. Their first point of contact is with a pharmacist who undergoes essentially a 45-minute interview with them to ensure that they meet treatment guidelines. And should they meet the guidelines, they leave with a prescription for induction of Suboxone therapy. It's really early data that we're receiving from this is remarkable from the patient's mindset. I'm going to tell you a story here that is near and dear to my heart because it happens to be at my old pharmacy. We have a pharmacist there, Fred, who he shared a consumer with me of a story of a consumer who entered our study, and we'll call the consumer James to protect his identity. But Fred and James initially bonded over a cell phone game. So James was waiting in the waiting area, waiting for Fred to do that initial appointment with him. And Fred commented, "What game are you playing?" And they happened to be playing the same game. Hopefully Fred wasn't doing it at work, but they were playing the same phone game and they bonded over it. And James, this simple conversation and treating him like a person really helped him open up to Fred. We learned from James that he had been in prison 2 times before. And this is a direct quote from him. He said, "When I was using, I felt like a waste of life and that my life was a waste." And he said when he went to his treatment center before, he felt like a criminal. And he said they didn't want me to ask too many questions. And James had a lot of questions for Fred. In fact, he was very interested in how the medication being prescribed to him, Suboxone, worked. So Fred was there to answer his questions. And he explained everything to James. And now James shares everything with Fred. James has shared when he has used, when he's had a relapse. So Fred was able to make some real-time adjustments to the medication that were being prescribed and relay those back to the doctor in the collaborative practice agreement. James explained to Fred that I've been having difficulty treatment. He started opening up more about other things that were going on in his life, other parts of his healthcare. And he told Fred that he was using a friend's gabapentin. So Fred said, We need to focus on the therapies that are being prescribed to you today, but I'll reach out to your primary care physician and see if we can do something to help you. Sure enough, now James is on a medication that is much safer for him to use. Him and Fred are best buddies still, even though the study participation portion has ended. So he still comes by and sees Fred and gets his other medications. And that's really where we try to aim to make a difference at Genoa Healthcare. It's partnering with clinical partners such as MAT programs or community mental health centers to have a pharmacist involved in the healthcare delivery system to the patient. There's a huge gap between when the patient is seen, a prescription is written, and then what happens to it. And that's our aim to solve that. We've seen a huge increase of consumers using Genoa in the Genoa pharmacies through the pandemic. In fact, it's grown over 186%. So that's about 15 new MAT consumers at each Genoa site in 2020. And what we're proud to announce is that even with all of the challenges that the last year presented to us, we had a 0% dip in consumers that were not adherent with their MAT therapy. 100% of the 80% drug PDC, the percentage of days covered for therapies, did not decrease at all. We're very, very proud of that. And now I'd like to turn it over to a real life example. So we're very fortunate to have Percy on the call today. And he comes for us from Missouri through a center called ARCA, in which they have a co-located Genoa pharmacy. And I'd like to turn it over him today to talk about how that relationship works and how we can continue to make therapy more attractive for consumers. Go ahead, Percy.
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon. I bring you greetings from exciting St. Louis. A little bit about my background. I'm a pharmacist by training, but never practiced pharmacy. All my life I spent in sales and marketing. And I happen to work for evil pharma, that is also we are always accused of. And the company I worked for, their claim to fame was developing two amazing medications, naloxone and Narcan. And my job when I was a teenager was to promote these, train physicians how to use these medications. And you'll be surprised, and maybe some of you will be astonished, that these medications got no traction. When we introduced naloxone way back in 1973, they said this cannot happen. You cannot have a drug that is so dramatic, okay? You are just exaggerating the benefits, get lost kind of stuff. And then we came out with the first non-opioid drug that was designed to prevent people from relapsing. All of you who are in the field know the most frustrating part of treatment is relapse. You do everything for them, and then they just go and relapse. What can you do? How can you protect them when they're back in the swamp, and the swamp is just steaming, is teeming with crocodiles? What do we do? And naltrexone was developed as that non-addicting drug that would form this barrier around your brain to protect you from accidental or impulsive use of opioids. That's how I started. But 20 years ago, I said, this is my calling. I want to bring the treatment of addictive disorders into the mainstream of medicine. The longest time it was way out. Medicine had nothing to do with this. And because it was not part of medicine, it carried a very, very heavy stigma that still continues. Okay? And my goal is, why can't we treat it like any other chronic condition? Yes, as we continue the talk, I'll tell you there are some major differences, but it's a very treatable illness. And ironically, the interesting thing is that we know how opioids enter the brain. We don't know that about any other drug. We don't know how cocaine enters the brain. We don't know how methamphetamine enters the brain. And therefore, we don't have any specific medications for that. But opiates enter the brain through a very narrow channel called the opiate receptors. And therefore, as Kevin talked, we have three distinct medications that can help patients. Okay. We'll go to the next slide. Okay. So anyway, we know how the present day addiction occurred. It started off when some irresponsible pharmaceutical companies promoted opioids for chronic pain. You and I know that opiates are not appropriate for chronic use. they're well suited for acute pain in the hospitalized patients. But we created a new condition called quote unquote chronic pain. And we even said that it's a fifth vital sign, treat it aggressively, and the most effective medications are opioid. And now you know what a mess it created. Okay. To add insult to the injury, as the opioid scripts increased and increased and increased, the narco terrorists, mostly based in Mexico, saw a great opportunity to bring heroin as a low-cost opioids. What is heroin? It acts in the same part of the brain. So instead of having to pay a lot of money for oxycodone and things of that sort, now you could buy a heroin for a fraction of the cost. So think about heroin as a generic form of your prescription opioids. It created a major problem. So as we decrease the as we decrease the number of prescriptions for opioids, heroin just started filling that void, and we created a big problem. Next slide, please. Okay, we have to keep one thing in mind, that addiction is very different from other chronic conditions. Let's take an example like diabetes or migraines or something. If you have migraines, nobody says, you know what, I like to walk around with the throbbing headache, or I like to walk around with my blood sugar in the high 300s. No, you want to get it under control. But addictive disorders hijacks our biological instincts of survival. We all need the instincts to survive. The most basic is the primordial brain, which is involved in fight, flight, and procreate. That brain, we need that, and that is driven usually by pleasure. It takes over those instincts and tells you that you need the drug to survive. That's the part. Now, the scary part about recovery is that when you start helping this patient, they'll do well for a few days or a few weeks, and then they want to go back to it because suddenly the body tells them, your memory tells them, hey, you need to go back to that because remember how much fun we had when we were using drugs. Very few people with migraines want to go back to having a throbbing headache. So if you keep that in mind, then you'll find that when people relapse or they have lapses, it is not that frustrating. That's the nature of the disorder. I joke with people, and I can tell you, it's like I'm from India. Okay? If I don't eat Indian food every 2 or 3 days, I go into withdrawal because I miss the spicy food. Now imagine if I'm told that I cannot eat Indian food for the rest of my life or for months to come, I'm going to fight it. And if I have the opportunity, I'm going to sneak in and get some there. Think about addictive disorders, drugs being maybe 100 times more attractive than Indian food is. So this is the challenge we have, that the human beings are also endowed with the prefrontal cortex, which is right here, which controls our impulses. So that functioning is a very smooth functioning that allows us to multitask and not give in to our impulses. In addiction, this control mechanism is lost. And you are working, think about you're driving a car with no steering wheel and no brakes. So all your focus is, how can I get my next high? And that is why what happens with addiction is that you go from a thriving mode to a survival mode. And human beings are created to thrive, not to survive. You survive, you are in a survival mode when you're caught in a storm, you're in a refugee camp where your life is in danger, and you will do anything to survive, lie, cheat, steal, sell your body to survive. And that's exactly what happens. So the goal of treatment is not just giving them a pill, but helping them to move from a survival mode back to a thriving mode. How do we do that? Okay, I was very fortunate to know some of the top researchers in the country. And I said, I'm going to make treatment attractive and bring it into the mainstream of medicine. The next slide, this is what we are dealing with. If I can have the next slide. Okay. We'll talk about stigma a little later, the one about humanizing the treatment. The next slide. Okay, this is where we are. Just go back to once. Okay, what you see with addictive disorders, we have done everything to this. We have stigmatized it, we have commercialized it, we have marginalized it, demonized it, done everything. And the more we do of these things, we increase the stigma for the disorder, and it goes down and down to the bottom of the stigma pyramid. What we need is humanizing the treatment, give it a human touch, and make it attractive. I always tell my staff, I said, your competitor is the drug dealer who is enticing them to you to sell whatever they have, barter their drugs and get it. We are competing with them. And the next slide will tell us what humanizing is. 35 years ago, we had a similar mindset when it came to AIDS and HIV. We thought AIDS was hedonism, AIDS was immoral behavior, went on and on. Okay? And we're willing to condemn that. This picture on the left was really the watershed moment in the fight against AIDS and HIV. You saw this father cradling his dying son's head and say, "Come." And this, what changed it changed our country to say we have to humanize treatment for AIDS and HIV. On the other side, on the right-hand side, we have demonized addiction but this picture went viral. They were grandparents, both heroin addicts, struggling, and they were giving a ride to their grandparents, and they somehow found some heroin, and obviously they were in such severe withdrawal, they used it with the grandchildren in the back of the car, and this is what happened. Now, instead of showing some degree of caring, what happened? We immediately demonized it and condemned them. We need an AIDS moment in our field, but we can do it in a very small way. But I realized that what we have to do is come up with some very specific steps in how to do that. The first is treatment on demand. We cannot tell a patient who is in severe withdrawal that, you know what, I'm sorry, we don't have a spot open for the next 3 days or 5 days. Can you imagine somebody with chest pains or shortness of breath saying, the ER says we can't take you in because there's no place? No, it should be shown the same level of urgency as you go for any other medical condition. And that's what ARCA has done. We have to also offer them medical services. We have to medically detox them. Withdrawal is not just in the psyche, it's not just a behavioral issue, it is an actual neurochemical reaction in the body, and the symptoms are obviously increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, restlessness, and so on. You cannot tell them, just stuff it out, close your eyes, and meditate. It doesn't work. So we have protocols that are offered, that we give them, that will help them to detox them and stabilize them right in the clinic. And this can be done on an outpatient basis. And anyone wants to know more about it, you're welcome. We'll be happy to, tell you more about it, so on. The big missing piece was the on-site pharmacy. Now, what we've observed now, we treat some very heavy-duty people with addictive disorders. You'll be shocked to know that we treat close to 2,900 heroin addicts a month in our clinic. I mean, that's a staggering number. What we were observing at our clinic was that 37% of the patients were given a script, including Suboxone. They were given anti-anxiety medication. They were given medication. They were given muscle relaxants. They would not walk 3 blocks and get the medication filled. That's it. If you don't have your medication filled, your chances of doing well are virtually zero. And then the opportunity came with really tie up with Genoa. We met with Genoa, told them about our quandary, and Genoa says, we are looking for organizations just like yourself to really form a team. And we started the on-site pharmacy. And I'm not saying this just because we work closely with Genoa. What they did was truly amazing. Our medication refill, our medication compliance has gone up to almost 97%. So these patients come to our clinic, They are stabilized, they're seen by the doctor, they have a nice place, they can take a nap, sleep there. Many of them fall asleep. They just walk across the hall, go to the Genoa pharmacy, and have the medication filled. And when they go there, nobody looks at them with, is this guy going to steal something from me? Like when they would go to a community pharmacy, there are all sorts of eyes following them, because that's a human nature. What are they going to do here? When they came to the Genoa pharmacy, the staff smiled at them. They talked to them. And this was another teachable moment where the pharmacist would explain to them how Suboxone works, how naltrexone works. And this is part of what I call treatment, making treatment attractive. But we also know that just that is not enough. Many of them have serious other issues. They have issues with marital issues, legal issues, housing issues, employment issues. You have to peel each of the onion peel. And that's what you do. That's what we call enhancement, recovery enhancement. So see what their needs are, offer them case management. We have peer support specialists who do an incredible job. We have psychiatrists, we have internists. All that, it takes a village to treat the patient. But believe me, 95% of the patients who come to us, they had never experienced such a holistic approach offered in such a compassionate and caring manner. So addiction is not, it's not like treating somebody with a complex stroke or a heart attack where you need all sorts of interventions. All you need is a healthy dose of passion and a healthy dose of compassion, and create the ingredients you need. What are the ingredients? Again, I want to repeat, treatment on demand. We have an urgent care clinic. You can walk in, you don't need an appointment. Okay? We are going to detox you and stabilize you. We have an on-site pharmacy. You can pick up the meds, and we will set up a time for you to come back again. And once they take the meds, that's the beginning of the recovery. They get involved with it. And when they know this is a safe haven, I can go here. And then we offer them sometimes housing, you name the services, we can do that. Our staff, if they have, many of these patients have never seen a physician for their medical conditions. Their blood pressure is, out of control. Their blood sugar is out of control. Our staff will help them give them medication to control their blood pressure. If they have a wound or infection, they'll give them a script for an antibiotic, again, filled at the on-site pharmacy. And then we'll set up an appointment for them to go to an FQHC for the long-term care. When you do that, what you're doing is helping these patients move from a survival mode to a thriving mode. And ask yourself the question over and over again, what are we doing to help these patients walk the steps to a thriving mode? Think about the Maslow's pyramid. What are we doing to re-invert Maslow's pyramid, where they are back, they're not in a survival mode, where now they can get involved with their family, with finding jobs, going to vocational training, and all those things. And that is the most rewarding part of treatment. Let me see and when you do this, you will see one of the biggest benefits is the stigma just drops down. I said this over and over again, that the only way to reduce stigma is show better outcomes. Show better outcomes and the stigma vanishes. And this is the only condition where if the patient does badly, you blame the patient. I'm doing such a good job. I'm not doing anything wrong. It's the patient's fault. If the patient relapses, that's parts of the recovery process. What can we do to help them? We don't ever fire our patients because we saw them. But say, what can I do? Maybe you have to change the medication, give them a slightly higher dose, get them to come to the clinic more often, whatever it takes to do that. And when you do it, the patient feels that they are part of the ARCA center. They're part of ARCA. And so many of our patients have done well. They also have got jobs. And this is an open invitation to the participants. I'm so happy that over 250 have joined in. This is my address. This is the ARCA for Genoa and for assisted recovery. We are very good about responding to questions and emails. because we have a major problem. What is so distressing for me is the figures that are being shown saying that this is going to continue, opiate addiction is going to continue for the next 10 years, and be prepared that we will lose 50,000 people a year for the next 10 years. To me, that is unacceptable. We have the resources, we have the knowledge base, let's use it, and let's prove all those pundits wrong. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to being in touch with you.
I love it. Thank you, Percy. Let me personally thank you for all the great work you folks are doing out there at ARCA. We are so proud to work with you. As Percy said, this is our contact information. Let's not let the discussion end here. We're passionate about being part of the solution here at Genoa Healthcare. As you heard Percy talk about how we've been able to increase prescription fill rates for people undergoing MAT at his center. And if you have a clinic in mind or a community mental health center that needs some prescription solutions, please feel free to email us at either one of those email addresses below, and we will get back to you. We wanted to make sure that we had some time for questions today. So if you'll see a Q&A button on your screen, or you can type the questions in the chat, whichever you prefer. And Lindsey, have you collected some questions for Percy or myself?
Yes, thank you both. And we have had some questions come in. Kevin, the first question is for you. Can any prescriber write a prescription for naltrexone, or does it require additional training or certification?
Yeah, naltrexone is great. It does not require any additional training. So anyone who is allowed to prescribe medications can prescribe naltrexone.
Thank you. Percy, the next question is for you. Can you share an example of how the partnership of the clinic in Genoa helped to better meet your patients' needs?
The biggest advantage was prescriptions being filled at the time of seeing the patient. They just walk across the hall and they picked up the meds. This was almost unheard of. For many of these patients, they almost would dread to go to a local pharmacy because they were treated badly. As soon as you walked in, they kind of looked at them suspiciously, and they'll say there's a 1 hour wait period. Can you imagine asking them to stand, just cool their heels for an hour? Here, within minutes, the prescription is filled. So that's a big advantage, because for the first step towards successful treatment is effectively treating the withdrawal symptoms. Once you have done, that's the beginning of the patient's recovery.
Thank you, Percy. And this question is for you, Kevin, and relates nicely. How many consumers or patients are needed for a clinic to have a pharmacy?
Yeah, that's kind of a difficult question to answer, because we don't have like a particular bucket of how many patients we need. We'd love to put a pharmacy everywhere, but we do need a significant patient base that we're happy to look at to see which of our pharmacy solutions works for you. So if we're not able to implement a full service pharmacy, in many states we're allowed to embed a pharmacy technician inside your center that can essentially quarterback the prescriptions over to the nearest Genoa pharmacy, deliver those over daily. Or we can do a central fill model where we're filling from the pharmacy, mailing or delivering directly to consumers' homes. And finally, we could, in some states, we're allowed to do smaller remote dispensing pharmacies where there's not a pharmacist live, but the prescriptions are filled on site and checked remotely through telepharmacy. So if you're interested, like I said, reach out to me at my email address. We'll happy to connect you with someone who can assess which model your clinic needs and which one we can offer.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think we have time for one more. There are a couple that we are not going to get to, so we will be sure to follow up after the session with you directly. Kevin, this partner said that they've appreciated the ability to send patients to get the COVID vaccine, as well as some of the other staff at their clinic. Are there additional plans to provide vaccines this year, or even the flu shot?
Yes, thank you for that. Like I said before, well, I'll be happy someday we don't have to mention COVID, but it is not done. It's not near to done. We are still have the capability of administering COVID vaccines at our Genoa locations. So if that need is still present in your clinic, and it should be everywhere, please reach out to vaccine@genoahealthcare.com. In the fall, we'll be providing flu shots. The nice little A side effect of COVID is that it's helped vaccination rates for flu. So my hope is that people will continue that trend. We are going to be offering flu vaccinations at every Genoa location. So please, if you already have a Genoa pharmacy, reach out to your DOO to start scheduling flu clinics, or we can do walk-in clinics as well. Get vaccinated so we can all be together soon.
Thank
Well,
you,
with that-
Kevin and Percy.
Yeah, I think we're out of time here today. I wanted to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. It's certainly, you can hear Percy's passion, and it's my passion as well. I was once told a sentence that changed the way I think about MAT, which was, no one wakes up in the morning and decides that they are going to become an addict. And I think that that's important, right? That this is a way of humanizing, that this is something we can treat, and something we should treat with compassion. So please feel free to reach out to us. And once again, thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you on a future webinar.